Joining me live is leader of the National Party, David Littleproud. How are you this afternoon, David?
Yeah, good to be with you on a Saturday afternoon.
Nice to have you, and thank you for taking the time out. But let's start with the announcement of the minimum wage increasing this week by 5.2%. Many, of course, have welcomed this news. However, we're hearing that some farmers are warning prices of meat, fruit and vegetables could go up. Today we're talking about strawberries. However, the profits are not going to the farmers. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is a worrying development. And what we're seeing is that farmers are being asked to absorb much of this, and much by supermarkets. And in fact, I've actually only heard yesterday that some of the supermarkets are adding onto their gross profit a couple of percent just to take advantage of the current situations, which is not just exacerbated by wages, it's also by the recent flooding that's meant that we haven't got the supply that's put pressure on prices. And so supermarkets are running right with this, and it's important that the ACCC, who really have been a toothless tiger, get into the crux of this matter and get underneath the bonnet of the market to make sure that farmers are being protected, but also consumers are being protected. It's also been exacerbated by the fact that we have a shortage of labour on the ground. And when the Labor Party, when they came to government, abandoned the ag visa, what that meant is that it's put a constraint on the labour supply into agriculture. And while the minimum wage has gone up, in many farms already they're paying well above it because they have to get their crops off, such as the competitive nature. But what Labor has done has removed that availability of a different labour supply. And while Anthony Albanese only yesterday came out and said he wants to expedite the visas for construction workers, but won't look after the agricultural sector, Australian consumers need to look at the prices that they're paying at the supermarket and say that it's not just the supermarkets, it's also Anthony Albanese that is putting this price squeeze on them at the supermarket because of his policy driven by the AWU not to allow the ag visa to continue. And this is a diabolical situation that's adding to our inflation pressures, and Australian consumers are going to continue to pay at the checkout because of the short-sightedness of the Labor government predicated by what the AWU was saying.
What do you think a good alternative to the ag visa program is then if Labor's not wanting to have that on board? I'm hearing from many farmers across the country a possible alternative in their wish list would be to get more workers on the farms but have visas in terms of like more permanent visas so they could have their families stay there rather than just a few years in Australia and then back home.
Yeah, I think we need to look at all of it, and I think we also need to be pragmatic and look at grey nomads and say, well, if the grey nomads are out there and they're on a pension, do we look at the hours that they can work before their pension's impacted if they work in agriculture, if they work in specific industries? And so we're being pragmatic. We're disappointed that the Labor Party's moved away from the ag visa. But if there's grey nomads running around the country that can pick up a bit of work as they travel around and not impact their pension payments, well, why wouldn't we look at that? But we were trying to have a long-term structural change because it's not just about unskilled workers. This is the thing about the ag visa. It was about skilled and semi-skilled workers. And the problem we've got is what Labor want to do is just say, let's have the Pacific scheme, which is just tying a little bow around what we've already got in place. And it doesn't go to skilled and semi-skilled workers. So this is a real crunch, and that we're going to feel at the checkout unless there's some real action. And if they want to take away the availability of the ag visa workers, then we need to look at what else we can do. But we also need to understand that it will take time for farmers to get their crops back in after the floods, and that the wages that are being paid aren't being absorbed by farmers. And this is where the ACCC need to stand up. They've been missing in action for many, many years when it comes to agriculture, and I think they've been just short of diabolical for agriculture. They've been a real disappointment, and they need to get under the bonnet of this and make sure there's real transparency, not just for farmers, but it's also for consumers.
How long do you think we're going to have to be paying for these prices, these increased prices for certain produce? And what is the latest with the backpacker situation? How soon will we start to see more people coming into the country?
Yeah, look, just before the election, ABARES gave me advice that they thought there was probably at least 6 months. And in fact, when you looked at some of the inflationary pressures that were coming from increased food prices is that it was probably 6 months, such as the production cycle, to get crops in and get them harvested. So it is important to understand that, and so we need to work through that. But we've got to understand that backpackers aren't coming back tomorrow. It's going to take some time. Before COVID hit, there was about 150,000 backpackers in this country. We were down to under 30,000 before the election, and there's no real change in terms of numbers, in significant uplift that we're going to see. This is going to be a slow burn, and that's why the ag visa was important. It was a structural change away from transient workforce to one that we were giving a pathway to permanent residency. We're saying let's bring in the next generation of migrants that are going to grow regional Australia, grow agriculture, live out in regional Australia, not just pass through. And this is why it's important to understand that backpackers are some time off. It's not going to happen overnight. It's probably going to take at least 12, 18 months at least before backpackers of any scale are going to start coming back once there's confidence in borders, once there's confidence at the end of COVID. It's not just going to happen overnight. And this is why this has been a small-sided look at this by the Labor Party in walking away from the ag visa and simply saying they have no other solution than the Pacific scheme that we already have in place now.
The big discussion on live sheep exports. You were just in WA and you've encouraged Premier Mark McGowan to educate people on the importance of live sheep exports. What was his response?
Well, unfortunately, he wouldn't meet with me, but I've got to say I'm not going to tear Mark McGowan down because he's the only Labor politician showing common sense. He understands the importance of this industry to Western Australia, but the role that we play globally in making sure that animal welfare standards are maintained. What the Labor government has shown, and Murray Watt said immediately, was that he wants to shut this down on science. And he also admitted that they hadn't even done any modelling on what the financial impact might be, which means you might have to compensate Western Australian farmers for that. And just to remind the Australian taxpayer out there, they're paying nearly $2 billion in compensation for the last time the Labor Party had control of live animal exports with Indonesian cattle, and they lost a court case on that. But there is no science. If you get back to the first principle of this as to why they're actually shutting this industry down, is they're saying that the science doesn't stack up. Well, the science does stack up because what we put in place, reforms in 2018 when I was Minister, after the Awassi hit, was we moved from a mortality methodology in terms of making sure that the standards on those boats were exemplary to an animal welfare one. So much so that we have independent observers on those boats that count the pants per minute of sheep in those pens to make sure that they aren't in any distress. That is the standard that is world leading, that no other country in the world actually has adopted. And so if we actually phase this out and we shut it down, then all we're doing is exporting the animal welfare standards of Australia to another country such as Ethiopia or Sudan. And I don't think that they're going to have the same regulatory framework that we have. This industry is sticking around, and it's not just for cultural reasons, it's also for food security reasons. Many of these countries don't have the cold storage supply chain capacity that we do, and so they have to process these animals in country. And we've got very strict records about how we look after them when they're in country as well in terms of the processing. So we have a complete supply chain management system that supports the animal welfare standards that Australians would expect. But what Labor's saying is, let's just cut and run. And let's just pay farmers in Western Australia some more compensation. That's not the Australian way. The Australian way is to stay, to do the job right, and to lead the world, and that's what exactly we're doing right now. And I think Mark McGowan, as I said to him publicly, is I'll take your hand, let's walk into Canberra and let's educate these Eastern politicians about exactly how you do it and the importance not only to Western Australia but to Australia and to animal welfare standards globally.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people don't like the whole live sheep exports. Why is Labor not extending this ban to live cattle exports?
Well, they're not at the moment. They've already banned it once before in 2011, which is costing you, the Australian taxpayer, close to $2 billion in compensation. But what they've shown is that they are prepared to be spooked easily. And I wouldn't say that everybody doesn't like live exports. Can I say particularly, research that I've seen shows that less than a third of the Australian population don't like it. A third understand it, and another third don't understand it, but are agnostic to it. So it's important that as governments, we put the framework, the regulatory framework around the industry to give the community confidence that we're doing this safely and that we're doing it the best in the world. And that's what we've done. And what worries us, and what worries particularly the cattle industry, is that once Labor folds on live sheep, they'll fold again on cattle like they did in 2011. And that's actually going to destroy Northern Australia's production systems. They don't have the capacity to have feedlots up there of any major scale because they grow pasture that's actually not to the scale that we can, and they are unable to produce the large volumes of grain. So this is a challenge that you would take away the pastoral industry, particularly in Northern Australia, Northern Territory and in Northern Queensland, that would just take many livelihoods away. And as we've seen, it costs over $2 billion to compensate those families, those small businesses out there that have been impacted by Labor's decision. So you shut one part down, they're coming to a state and industry near you, and that's what the cattle industry, particularly in Queensland and Northern Territory, are really worried about.
All right, we do have to wrap it up there, but last time I spoke to you, you were very excited about the State of Origin #1. The Queenslanders won. State of Origin #2 coming up. Who's going to win? Come on. New South Wales?
Oh, look, Jane, it goes without saying. Well, no, you haven't got a hope in hell. I mean, but look, I've been a little bit cautious until we get that second one, then I will really rub it in. We're one up, but till you're 2-0, which I'm pretty confident we will be in a Sunday week, I'm pretty confident it's all over Red Rover. And we'll be humble as always, as Queenslanders, we always are. We've got the weight of the nation on our shoulders, but you know, we're always humble in victory as well.
How come you're shaking your head as you're saying we'll be humble, as in like it's no? You know, you'll be humble. Yeah, watch this space.
It's the Queensland way. Yeah.
Yeah, good luck. All right, thanks so much, Leader of the National Party, David Littleproud. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.